Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you're listening to Nature and the Nation. And for today's episode, I will be looking at The Great Betrayal by Patrick Buchanan. This is my second Patrick Buchanan book that I've reviewed. The other one was very early in the podcast, and that was A Day of Reckoning. And that is a very good book. This is also a very good book. Pat Buchanan is a very important thinker, in my opinion. He is sort of the precursor to Trump. His basic ideas are, I think, what propelled Trump into the presidency. And Trump and Buchanan have a bit of interaction in the past. They both ran at one point for the Reform Party presidential ticket. And so Trump was definitely aware of Buchanan, and I think he probably borrowed pretty heavily from Buchanan. The Day of Reckoning book, way back when, I reviewed it to sort of illustrate my own preference for a conservative vision. I think he raises three important points in that book, and I call those three protectionism, isolationism, and restrictionism. Some people don't like those words. I'm okay with them. I think those are the three important points that he raises. Protectionism, meaning protecting our economy through tariffs and other industrial policy that keeps our manufacturing in this country and keeps our factories from being exported overseas. Isolationism, avoiding entangling alliances and keeping our military on the home front rather than all over the world. And then restrictionism, in the sense of restricting who is allowed to come into this country, restricting immigration, mass deportations, and just having a much less immigration-focused policy in this country. And he really speaks to all three of those things in Day of Reckoning. Day of Reckoning, I believe, was 2004, and this one came out in 98, so this was a little bit beforehand. What had actually happened was Buchanan ran for president, ran for the Republican nomination in 92 against Bush Sr., and then in 96 against Dole. And he lost both times. After the second time that he lost for his run for the nomination, he was advised to write a book, or he attempted to write a book about his ideas for why he was running for president, and ultimately determined that he had more than one book that needed to get written. There was so much to be said. He really had three books. And so then he wrote three books detailing his three core principles: the protectionism book, the isolationism book, and the restrictionism book. And then after he had written those three books, he wrote Day of Reckoning to sort of bring it all together. So I read that one, and that was like the top level view, really, of his proposals. And then I want to right now jump back to the first of those three books. This one here, The Great Betrayal, that talks about protectionism. He's got the other book, Republic Not an Empire, and then the third book after that deals with protectionism, State of Emergency, I believe that one is. And I want to get to those two at some point down the road. But first, let's just attend to this one. This is an interesting topic to me: protectionism, tariffs, economic nationalism, as it's called. This is something that has been traditionally sort of unpopular on the Republican side. There's a very strong trend toward free markets and free trade, international free trade, on the right. And some of the people who were opposed to things like NAFTA and free trade agreements oftentimes came from the left, people like Ralph Nader, and I believe even Dennis Kucinich, people that were opposed to some of these large free trade agreements. Over time, it has become more acceptable on the right to be opposed to these free trade agreements and opposed to this offshoring of our manufacturing capability. There are national security implications, obviously, and even the raw economics of it. People are starting to say, well, you know what, it actually doesn't make sense. And, in some sense, the proof is in the pudding, and I think people are largely disappointed with some of the results of our free trade policies. And so it's becoming more popular on the right, and I think Donald Trump played an important part in making that more popular and more acceptable on the right. So as in all my episodes, I'm going to read a few sections here of parts that I think are really pertinent to the most important parts of his message and that relate maybe to some of the other things that I talk about in my podcast. So I want to read a few sections and then comment on those. And the first part that I want to read is this section here early in the book. This section is called Who Lost America? And I want to read a good chunk of that, where he says, quote, "The decline and fall of Middle America was neither preordained nor inevitable. It was engineered in Washington, D.C. Wages have fallen, and the standard of living of American families has stagnated because of a basic law, the law of supply and demand. The price of labor has been dropping because the supply of labor has exploded. In the Truman and Eisenhower administrations, U.S. markets were thrown open, and Europeans and Japanese invited in. What better way to convert them from war-racked nations into prosperous allies than to give their industries unimpeded access to America's vast and lucrative market, even if that meant low-wage competition for U.S. workers? The Allies responded with enthusiasm, carting off huge slices of America's market while fencing off their own. Our statesmen did not protest. After all, we were the leaders of the free world. We had to set an example. Though the Allies had fully recovered by 1960, the unilateral American concessions continued. Then, with the Immigration Act of 1965, America threw open the golden door, and tens of millions of immigrants burst through. To their number has been added annual invasions of millions of illegal aliens crossing our southern border to compete with unskilled and semi-skilled Americans. Illegal immigrants in the United States now number 5 million, and the U.S. labor supply has grown by more tens of millions in the past 25 years than in any other period in history. How could the price of labor not fall? Next came the global trade deals that put American labor into competition with hundreds of millions of Latins, East Asians, Chinese, Eastern Europeans, and Russians. Energetic, talented, hungry, these workers will do the jobs Americans do for a fraction of the pay an American family needs for a living wage. Foreign workers, however, do not compete with the children of affluence. They compete with that half of the nation who never graduated from college or never even went to college. Having declared free trade and open borders to be America's policy, why are we surprised that corporate executives padlocked their plants in the Rust Belt and moved overseas? Why keep your plant here when you can manufacture at a fraction of the cost abroad, ship your goods back, and pocket the windfall profits that come from firing $20 an hour Americans and hiring 50-cent an hour Asians? A pair of Nikes that sells for $150 in the United States cost $5 in wages to make in Indonesia. Any wonder that Nike President Philip Knight is the fifth richest man in America with $5.2 billion, while his Indonesian workers make 31 cents an hour? Under both parties, the U.S. government has stacked the deck against the American worker. Take a helicopter above the Tijuana border at sunset. You will see crowds of Mexicans forming up to dash into the United States, and you will see all the new factories going up on the Mexican side. We export our jobs to Mexico. It exports its jobless to us. The great trade-off of NAFTA. Practical men, said John Maynard Keynes, are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. America's elites are slaves to the ideas of 19th century European scribblers, none of whom ever built a nation. Our industrial base is shrinking, and Middle America's standard of living is no longer rising because we forgot how America became a mighty industrial power, and we embraced the myth that it was free trade that made us great. To challenge this myth, now an article of faith in both parties, is to be treated as imbecilic or immoral. Yet the lie must be exposed, for more is being sacrificed on the altar of this Moloch than the jobs of our workers and the standard of living of our people. Our politics are being corrupted. Our dependence on unstable foreign regimes is growing, and our survival as a self-reliant and independent republic is at risk. Both parties have collaborated in the sellout. In embracing free trade, Democrats betrayed their workers. In worshiping this golden calf, Republicans turned their back on their history, tradition, and greatest men. Most do not even know it, but they celebrate today what their wisest leaders used to ridicule as the utopian nonsense of the idiot savants of the Paris salons. End quote. So yeah, I like this section. It's just kind of the overview. We kind of opened all of our markets after World War II to these companies because we thought, well, we need to bring them into an economic relationship with us. And he talks about like repairing after the war-racked nations after World War II in the Truman and Eisenhower administrations. But then what happened is the Cold War, and we thought, we have to maintain this like free market relations with these companies. We can't have any tariffs. We want to be like bound up with them, and we want their prosperity to be dependent on us. And they can grow richer at our expense, but they will remain in the American orbit, and we are a strong enough nation to kind of support them. And so that was the theory, and, we won the Cold War. Who's to say that didn't work? We had these nations in our economic orbit. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, it may have been time to return to normal and to sort of reimpose some of these protective barriers now that we've allowed these other allies of ours to take on so much of our manufacturing, but that's not really what happened. Eventually, that's what has become more popular, but at the time this book was written in 1998, like free trade theory really was the main accepted theory, and it wasn't until Trump came along that the political right, at least, began to open their eyes to the need for some sort of protective economics, some sort of economic nationalism. And that's still not fully accepted by the right by any means. There are still a lot of people on the right that do not agree with tariffs. But yeah, then of course the Immigration Act, and he says there are 5 million illegal immigrants when he writes this book. It's like 30 million now. It's just insane. We've had more than 5 million, I think, come in just this year alone. It's utterly insane, but that's the topic for another book. Moving right along here. He talks about the basic fallacies of free trade theory. And he traces a lot of it back to Adam Smith, although he does defend Adam Smith in this book a little bit, and I'll get to that later. He also attributes some of the core fallacies of free trade to some of the theories of Adam Smith. So in regards to the first fallacy, he says, quote, Adam Smith's famous quotation is often cited as the core of the free trade gospel. It is the maxim of every prudent master of a family, never attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. The tailor does not attempt to make his own shoes, but buys them of the shoemaker. The shoemaker does not attempt to make his own clothes, but employs a tailor. What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. These words are as true today as they were then, writes Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman. But Milton Friedman notwithstanding, these words are not true today, they never were. To equate the decisions of a private family with those of a great kingdom is absurd. A great nation can and will prudently borrow from itself, as America did in 2 world wars, and go into debt for generations. No family can do that. Families are natural friends, while nations are rivals, antagonists, and often mortal enemies. To compare a family's dependence on a grocer or gas station to a nation's dependence on imported food or OPEC oil is folly for a leader and can be suicidal for a country. No family is self-sufficient. But no superpower can rely on foreign trade for the necessities of national survival and remain a superpower. End quote. I like that section a lot. This is really important. And sometimes I even make this analogy myself when I'm talking to someone about economics, or I'm talking to somebody about supply and demand, or the way tariffs work and things. I sometimes talk about, well, what are the way a person, interacts with their budget and whether they're, in debt, or how they're buying things as a sort of analogy for what the nation is doing. But it always has to be remembered that these are not the same thing. It's just not the same. It's not the same thing. You don't have to worry about you're being invaded by your neighbor. You don't have to worry about barricading your house to survive for like years on end without being able to engage in the normal trade, because these sorts of things happen on the global stage. There's a higher authority that makes sure that you and your neighbor treat each other in a certain way, and no authority exists on the world stage that's capable of overseeing the way that all nations interact with each other. It assumes a state of peace that cannot be assumed. We don't live in a world of permanent peace, obviously. So there's just a huge hole in the theory, so long as you try to build it around the way families interact with one another. So let's move to the next fallacy. The next fallacy, he says, quote, "The corruption of thought begins in the corruption of language. Politicians talk of trading partners, as though the relationship between the United States and China, or the United States and Japan, is comparable to that between Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Such language does not clarify, it distorts. Toyota and Ford, Boeing and Airbus are not partners, they are adversaries. They may enter into alliances, as even hostile nations do, but added market share for one means diminished market share for the other. Victory for one can mean death of the other. All we want is a level playing field, Americans plead. But as one economic historian has written, this term trivializes the issue. This is not some schoolyard game, where it doesn't matter who wins or loses. It is a struggle to control the world's wealth and resources, markets and territory, to provide for future generations and for the security of the nation. By defining the issue as one of fairness rather than outcome, the free traders have already steered thought into a dead-end channel. The state is a cold monster, said General de Gaulle. Surely there is more truth in the general's insight than in all our blather about a family of nations in the international community. At a 1981 press conference that horrified the diplomatic community, Ronald Reagan blurted, "The Soviets claim the right to lie, cheat, and steal." Reagan spoke the truth about the Cold War, and there are parallels with today's trade wars. Japan, France, and South Korea may be military allies, but each has a budget for industrial espionage and technology theft. Their principal target? The United States of America. Spies from 24 countries now operate on U.S. soil, looting the secrets of U.S. industries and targeting high-tech, defense, biotechnology, telecommunications, and computer software. Economic espionage, says James Kallstrom of the FBI's New York office, presents a new set of threats to our national security. The International Trade Commission estimates that in 1988 the United States lost, to economic and industrial espionage, $43 billion and 1 million American jobs. 43 governments are now sending students as sleeper agents to take jobs at vital U.S. industries, steal U.S. secrets, and send them back. End quote. So this is where the second fallacy is that we are partners. We are engaged in a sort of partnership, and this is, very much similar to the last fallacy. To be honest, it's the language that fails to recognize the state of affairs. That even if we're not, this sort of fraternal brotherhood with other nations, we're at least like partners with other nations in which we all want to sort of get ahead together and we all want to see global prosperity. And that's like really overblown. Power is a zero-sum game, and nations strive for global power. The pie grows bigger and everybody's slice grows bigger. Well, power is not a pie that grows ever bigger. Power is a zero-sum game, and as another country expands in power and strength, and as another country has successful economic transactions, as another country has industrial growth and a positive GDP growth, there's no reason that we should particularly celebrate other nations coming into their position as economic rivals of us. Nor should we celebrate other nations surpassing us in economic capacity. We're not just partners where we're playing a game together, we're in a struggle, like Buchanan says, for control of the world. We're in a struggle for limited resources. There's a lot at stake. And it's not just a game where we are partners or some such. So let's move on. The next fallacy, where he says, quote, "Here is another fallacy of free trade theory. What's best for its consumers is best for a country. But a nation is more than a consumer cooperative. It is a people, separate and apart, with its own destiny and history, language and faith, institutions and culture. And the national interest must take precedence over any consumer demand for foreign products. Carpe diem, seize the pleasure of the passing day, has proved a fatal philosophy to nations as it has to individuals." George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, entrusted with leadership of the infant republic, rejected the idea of letting consumer preferences shape the national destiny. A free people should promote such manufactories as tend to render them independent on others for essential, particularly military supplies, said Washington. Nor was James Madison content to entrust America's destiny to consumer whims when he discovered British ships dumping goods in U.S. ports to kill the industries begun during the War of 1812. Madison imposed a protective tariff. The economic nationalists who built America did not permit alien ideologies to prevent them from doing what was best for the nation. Britain, too, might dissent from the idea that buying cheapest is best for a nation. With the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, Britain became so dependent on imported food that she could not feed but a fourth of her people by World War I, and was almost starved to death by a submarine blockade. On whom did free trade Britain depend for survival? Protectionist America. Small nations, like Austria or Singapore, may never again be self-sufficient, but great nations like America, blessed by Providence with virtually all it needs to stand alone, have no excuse for allowing dependency to grow to the degree it has. Putting consumption first goes against the grain of common sense as well as inherited wisdom. Before consumption comes production. Before production, investment. Before investment, savings. And before savings, income, the reward for work. Before a family consumes bread, a farmer must plow the ground, sow the seed, till the field, wait, and watch. Before an athlete becomes a champion, he must exercise, train, discipline, and deny himself. No athlete ever consumed his way to an Olympic medal, and no nation ever consumed its way to greatness or prosperity. As Aesop's fable of the ant and the grasshopper teaches, he who puts consumption first has put his foot on the road to ruin. End quote. I like that section a lot, and I have other books about this topic of protectionism that go into this in more detail of the difference between consumption and production and how you can't evaluate the wealth or the prosperity or the success of a nation by the degree of material that it consumes. It doesn't matter so much how many apples you eat as whether or not you own the orchard is really what it comes down to. So let's move on from there. One more fallacy here, which is about the equality of industries, where he says, quote, "Behind free trade theory lies another fallacy. It does not matter which nations produce ships, aircraft, autos, radios, or computers, so long as all can exchange goods freely. But all industries are not equal. Had infant America followed free trade, our legendary industrial expansion would never have taken place, and America would never have dominated the 20th century. The 13 colonies had almost no industry. Had they followed free trade theory, we should have stayed with the production and export of cotton, corn, rice, and tobacco, those commodities in which we were most efficient, and imported our manufactured goods from England. America would have become the bakery and tobacconist of Europe. Instead, behind a protective tariff wall, we challenged and within a century displaced Great Britain as the greatest industrial nation on earth. As George Bush was about to go to war in the Persian Gulf over oil, the chairman of his Council of Economic Advisors told a business gathering, "It does not make any difference whether a country makes computer chips or potato chips." But as one critic pointed out, Patriot missiles won't work with potato chips or chocolate chips or wood chips or buffalo chips. The patriot depends on computer chips. Manufacturing is the key to national power. Not only does it pay more than service industries, but the rates of productivity growth are higher and the potential of new industry arising is far greater. From radio came television. From television, VCRs and flat panel screens. From adding machines came calculators and computers. From the electric typewriter came the word processor. Research and development follows manufacturing. End quote. Yeah, so I think this is probably just a really core point here. There is a difference between computer chips and potato chips. If your nation produces one or the other, it's not that all these goods are, $1 billion worth of potato chips or $1 billion worth of computer chips are really, translatable. And from an economic standpoint, they're both equal, $1 billion, $1 billion. But if your nation can produce potato chips but cannot produce computer chips, you cannot be a superpower. No nation has gotten a superpower status on the backs of potato chips or tobacco or rice or cotton. You need to be able to manufacture things such as weapons. And I know I've had episodes where I've talked about technology and as a potential potentially degrading force in the world. It's certainly worth considering. At the same time, it also seems pretty apparent that if you want to have a nation that is not subject to the will of another nation, you have to have contemporary effective weapons. If your nation has technological weapons of a certain sort, your nation needs to have them as well. And that seems to be fairly inescapable. And so you have to have a manufacturing base in order to be able to have that sort of defensive capability, it seems to me. So those are the primary fallacies, really, of free trade. And yet we continue to adhere to free trade policy without addressing any of these fallacies, really. And about that, he says the following. He says, quote, "Why haven't the harsh consequences of globalism for working Americans persuaded more politicians to take a second look? Because, for many, free trade is a matter of faith. They can no more give it up than Gus Hall can give up his belief in communism, or Teddy Kennedy his belief in liberalism. For 150 years, the London Economist has been preaching free trade. What does the Economist care that factories are moving out of the United States? It was not shaken in the faith when factories moved out of Great Britain. When the Economist began publishing, Great Britain produced nearly a quarter of the world's goods. Now, Britain produces about 3%. If one's allegiance is to one world, who cares if America is the dominant power? To a citizen of the world, a hollowing out of America's industrial power is an inconsequential, even a positive development. It matters deeply only to American patriots." During the Smoot-Hawley tariff debate, Labor leader Matthew Wall suggested a less flattering reason why it is harder to persuade an economist than an auto worker that free trade is ruinous. With few exceptions, the economists are free traders. They are neither producers nor creators of any commodity or article of trade. They are generally cloistered in the atmosphere of the schoolroom, and their mental wares do not enter into the competition with producers, where lower wage levels and longer working hours prevail, and where standards of living are not only lower, but in other respects much inferior to the standards built up in our own country under the American tariff policy. Briefly, these economists and college professors are consumers, not producers. The same holds true for diplomats, bureaucrats, foundation-fed scholars, journalists, professors, and politicians, all of whom tend to be pro-free trade. For them, the policy is not only politically correct, it's cost-free. End quote. And there you get really kind of the crux of the issue. He says, for the many, free trade is a matter of faith. They don't actually have to feel the consequences. The people who are economists and professors or writers at the Economist, they don't feel the impact necessarily, or especially if they have felt an impact, it's been sort of a late impact to the same extent that a manufacturer does. But more than just not feeling the impact of it directly is that it's an article of faith. It's an ideology of free trade. It's partly a sort of globalist ideology. It's partly a very strong dedication to free market principles. Who's arguing against it? It used to be once upon a time, the Republicans were arguing against it, and then for a while the Democrats were arguing against it. But there's always the ideology of globalism just sort of washes over it, and like we can all be prosperous and we can all get along, and we're ultimately going to dissolve nation states and live in one world government, like at the end of the tunnel. That's sort of whether you're a capitalist or a socialist. Oftentimes, the nation state itself just impedes the global vision. And these are guys who are bound up to a global vision. And those on the left and those on the right are often bound up in the global vision. That vision is not an American vision. It's not a nationalist vision. It's the idea that we're all going to be prosperous together. It's a sort of utopian vision. And they're caught up in this utopian vision. And like all these economists from all these different nations, they all know each other and they all talk and they all gather and they're all part of this sort of international clique of high-level economists. And, you wonder if any of them were to start arguing in favor of things that were only to the advantage of their particular nation, if they wouldn't be seen as like oddly provincial by all of the other economists. I don't know, let's move to the next section here. He starts to talk about American history, and he brings up Alexander Hamilton, who is really a great figure in this area. He says, quote, "A teenager when the Revolution broke out, Alexander Hamilton had risen to become aide-de-camp to Washington, a general, and an author of the Federalist Papers. When Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, declined Washington's offer to become his Secretary of the Treasury, he recommended Hamilton. It was a providential proposal. Born to an unknown father and an immigrant with no ties to any one state, this veteran of Valley Forge and Yorktown was a born nationalist, envied for his brilliance, disliked for his brashness, disparaged for his origins. Adams called him the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. Hamilton gave his love, loyalty, and eventually his life to his country. On December 5th, 1791, Treasury Secretary Hamilton delivered his famous Report on Manufactures. The goal of U.S. trade policy was national self-sufficiency. America had to stand on its own, calling for subsidies to build a web of turnpikes, roads, and canals, and for tariffs to shelter the home market. Hamilton's report would become our blueprint of economic independence. In it, he spoke of those necessities of nationhood for which Americans could not depend on foreign trade. The wealth, independence, and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufactures. Every nation ought to endeavor to possess within itself all the essentials of national supply. These comprise the means of subsistence, habitation, clothing, and defense." Of that report, future Senator Arthur Vandenberg would write in his 1921 tribute, The Greatest American, that it remains to this day the most lucid and convincing and complete defense of a protective tariff system which has ever been given to the American people. This was the Washington-Hamilton plan to create a more perfect union, tie the seacoast to the west with bonds of commerce, use tariffs to favor U.S. manufacturers and raise the revenue to pay off the war debt, establish public credit, institute a policy of internal improvements, roads, canals, bridges, turnpikes, to bind the states together into a nation. Protectionism, then, is not some alien dogma. It is America's own invention, the defense perimeter of the world's greatest free trade zone, an integral element of the American free market system, and an indispensable contributor to national prosperity. Protectionism was made in the USA. End quote. I like that section because he's right. Right back from the very beginning of our nation's founding, we were right off the bat building up protectionist tariff walls. We were protecting our nation from foreign competition. And I've spoken to people that say, well, it's just, you would do that sort of thing like to protect infant industries, but it's not appropriate for like established industries. And I think it's always necessary to protect your industries, no matter what stage they're in, because there's a lot riding on them. They simply cannot be allowed to fail. That's not to say that one business can't be allowed to fail. Businesses must be allowed to fail, but industries themselves we should be very wary before we allow industries to fail, particularly when those industries are failing because they're falling into the hands of another nation. So anyway, let me move on from there. He talks a bit more here about Adam Smith, and this section's a little bit longer, but Adam Smith makes a few exceptions to the principle of free markets and free trade that he generally is considered to espouse. Buchanan talks about that here, and he says, quote, "In 1776, Adam Smith published An Inquiry into the Nation and Cause of the Wealth of Nations. In this most famous of economic treatises, the justification of a free market economy was first set forth. Ever since, Smith has been conscripted as a lead witness in the prosecution's case against protectionism. But contrary to conventional wisdom, Adam Smith was no open borders, free trade über all libertarian. The system described in The Wealth of Nations is a national free market system. Nations, said Smith, should sell abroad what was not needed for home consumption, and buy abroad what could not be produced at home. Smith supported the Acts of Trade and Navigation under which British trade had to be carried in British ships manned by British seamen, calling the laws the wisest of all the commercial regulations of England. Said Smith, a nation's defense is of much more importance than opulence. Reclusive intellectual, friend of Voltaire and Turgot, Smith was tutor to the stepson of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, when he imposed the customs duties that ignited the American Revolution. That Smith put national interests first is evident in the exceptions he listed to a British policy of free trade. There are occasions, he wrote, when it must be advantageous to lay some burden upon foreign imports for the encouragement of domestic industry. The first is, when some particular sort of industry is necessary for the defense of the country. The defense of Great Britain, for example, depends very much upon the number of its sailors and shipping. The Act of Navigation, therefore, very properly endeavors to give the sailors and shipping of Great Britain the monopoly of the trade of their own country, in some cases by absolute prohibitions, and in others by heavy burdens upon the shipping of foreign countries. Smith felt that Great Britain must maintain her monopoly of trade, even if it meant keeping foreign ships out of British ports. Smith's conviction, shared by British statesmen, guaranteed trouble, for independent colonists would surely one day seek to control their own trade. Then the clash must come. The second case, in which it will generally be advantageous to lay some burden upon foreign imports for the encouragement of domestic industry, is when some tax is imposed at home upon the produce of the latter. In this case, it seems reasonable that an equal tax, i.e. tariff, should be imposed upon the like produce of the former. Smith listed two other occasions when the national interest might require tariffs. As there are two cases in which it will generally be advantageous to lay some burdens upon foreign for the encouragement of domestic industry, there are two others in which it may sometimes be a matter of deliberation. Some foreign nation may restrain by high duties or prohibitions the importation of some of our manufactures into their country. Revenge, in this case, naturally dictates retaliation, and that we should impose the like duties and prohibitions upon the import of some or all of their manufacturers into ours. There may also be good policy in retaliations of this kind, when there is a probability that they will procure the repeal of the high duties or prohibitions complained of. The recovery of a great foreign market will generally more than compensate the transitory inconveniency of paying dearer during a short time for some sorts of goods. Tariff as revenge on nations that closed markets to British goods and for the recovery of a great foreign market is economic nationalism. Using Smith's rule of reciprocity, the United States would today be imposing on China tariffs equal to the taxes and tariffs China imposes on U.S. imports. Smith also believed that tariffs should be reduced gradually to prevent a surge of imports that might throw thousands out of work. Humanity may require that the freedom of trade should be restored only by slow gradations, and with a good deal of reserve and circumspection. Were those high duties and prohibitions taken away all at once, cheaper foreign goods of the same kind might be poured so fast into the home market as to deprive all at once many thousands of our people of their ordinary employment and means of subsistence. When free trade purists summon Adam Smith as lead witness, they ignore his famous exceptions. But had we read Smith rightly, the United States would have saved its TV manufacturing industry. Instead, we turned a deaf ear to pleas for temporary protection when Japan began the massive dumping of high-quality Japanese TV sets at prices below the cost of production. American-made televisions were driven off department store shelves, and the U.S. industry drowned in a tidal wave of Sonys. Tens of thousands of high-paying jobs were lost, as were all the future benefits of television manufacture. In a premeditated strike, Japan destroyed America's industry, and in the name of free trade, our government passively observed the industrial equivalent of Pearl Harbor. Smith would never have tolerated such a blow to British national interests. Adam Smith, then, was no libertarian purist. He would keep foreign ships out of British ports to maintain naval supremacy. He favored tariffs as revenge on nations discriminating against British goods, as levers to wrench open foreign markets, and as weapons to recapture lost markets. He believed in tariffs on imported manufacturers to offset direct taxes on the home industry. Adam Smith believed in Britain first. From 1778 until his death, he served as a commissioner of customs, strictly enforcing Britain's protectionist policy against America's trade. To expect that freedom of trade should ever be entirely restored in Great Britain is as absurd as to expect that an Oceania or a Utopia should ever establish it, said Commissioner Smith. End quote. Okay, so that, like I said, that was a bit of a longer section, but I think it's interesting because Adam Smith apparently was the customs enforcer toward the end of his life. The Commissioner of Customs, enforcing Britain's protectionist policy. He was not totally on board with free trade all the time in all circumstances. He viewed it as something that could be used as a tool or even a weapon to enhance the national interests. He said there are a number of exceptions when a tariff could be used to open a foreign market that's closed, to respond to foreign aggression when other countries are using tariffs to attack the industry of the home nation. If a product is taxed in one country, a tariff has to be established so as to equally tax that product when made in another country. A number of exceptions. And ultimately, a trade policy is a tool that a nation uses to enhance its own prosperity. Otherwise, none of those things would make sense. So, one more person that Buchanan brings up that it's important to mention is Friedrich List. Friedrich List was a German, but he spent some time living in America, and he wrote about economics from a protectionist perspective, and was very well known for a while, although not many people know who he is today. But Buchanan talks about him a little bit, and I'd like to read that section to you, where he says, quote, 5 years before his death, List published The National System of Political Economy, which for a time would attain a prominence to rival the wealth of nations. Leaning heavily on Hamiltonian ideas and American experience, List gave 3 basic arguments for protectionism. First, infant industries of developing nations had to be protected. Why should Britain dominate world manufacturing simply because the British arrived first in the industrial age? List saw Britain's advocacy of free trade as naked self-interest. In a famous depiction, he described the doctrine as a clever device that when anyone has attained the summit of greatness, he kicks away the ladder by which he has climbed up, in order to deprive others of the means of climbing up after him. Second, though protectionism required short-term costs, such costs should be imposed for long-term gain. Like Hamilton, he took the long view. A nation that does not make such sacrifices risks being confined forever to producing raw materials and grain, which could never give it the standard of living that manufacturing could. Also, in echo of Hamilton, List argued that manufacturing was superior to agriculture. To Ricardo's argument that we should abandon the home industry and rely on imports if a foreign nation could manufacture more cheaply, List's reply was withering. Who would be consoled for the loss of an arm by knowing that he had nevertheless bought his shirts 40% cheaper. Third, as scholar and free trade advocate Richard Ebeling writes, List introduced Europe to the concept of national interest. List accused Adam Smith and other free trade economists of cosmopolitanism. Men were not part of a global community, List argued, in which their interests harmonized in a network of international commerce and division of labor. Between man and humanity was the nation. Each nation had its own history, culture, stage of development, and position of power relative to other nations in the world. And the economic prosperity of each man was tied up with the success or failure of his own nation's struggle for political and economic influence and control in the global competition between nation-states. For the nation's prosperity and betterment, it was often necessary for the individual to sacrifice his private interest in the arena of trade and profit opportunities for the national interest of the country to which he belonged. List had hit the Achilles heel of the Cobdenites. They celebrated the benefit of free trade for mankind, not the nation. But to List, mankind did not command one's allegiance. The world had no hold on the heart. It was nation and country that commanded love and loyalty. Between each individual and entire humanity stands the nation, with its special language and literature, origin and history, manners and customs, laws and institutions. With its separate territory, a society which, united by 1,000 ties of mind and interests, combines itself into one independent whole. List savaged the cosmopolitan school, mocking that these men wrote for a world in which nations cooperated, though such a world did not exist. In the real world, said List, Europe's nations were rivals, antagonists, with interests in conflict. Each was struggling for a superior place in the sun. Moreover, they were at different stages of development. When List wrote in 1841, neither Germany nor Italy was a unified nation. Whereas the classical economists argued that the choices of consumers would determine what was best for the country, List dissented furiously. The foreign trade of a nation must not be estimated in the way in which individual merchants judge it. The nation is bound to keep steadily in view all these conditions on which its present and future existence, prosperity, and power depend. The classical liberals had declared, consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. List retorted that only production renders consumption possible. The power of producing wealth, he wrote, is therefore infinitely more important than wealth itself. The forces of production are the tree on which wealth grows. The tree which bears the fruit is of itself of greater value than the fruit itself. The prosperity of a nation is not greater in the proportion in which it has amassed more wealth, i.e. values of exchange, but in the proportion in which it has developed its powers of production. List would be appalled to watch Americans get rich on the soaring stock prices of companies whose profits were exploding because they had moved factories overseas and exchanged American labor for Asian labor. List had an advantage over his contemporaries. Unlike the classical liberals, who had a theory, List had a working model. His ideas had been tested by Washington, Madison, and Jackson. The great Americans were all economic nationalists, and it was evident to the entire world that the United States was the economic marvel of the age. List had defined the theory by which the Founding Fathers had been guiding the Republic since the Tariff Act of 1789. But in his 1841 book, List went far beyond the economic nationalism of Hamilton. He began to lay the intellectual foundation for wholesale government intervention and the state socialism of Imperial Germany. Bismarck would keep a copy of List's work on his desk and make it the standard text of college students. When he came to power, the Iron Chancellor put many of List's ideas into practice. But Bismarck's interventions in the German economy far exceeded anything free market Americans like Washington, Hamilton, and Clay would have tolerated in a nation dedicated to freedom. End quote. So there's Friedrich List for you. Super cool guy. I have his book. I've read a good chunk of it, and I do want to get to review that book at some point in the near future. But let me just jump to the last section I want to read here. where he talks about nationalism, a favorite topic of mine. And he says the following, quote, "What, after all, is a nation?" French historian and philosopher Ernest Renan described it a century ago. "A nation is a living soul, a spiritual principle. Two things, which in truth are but one, constitute this soul, the spiritual principle. One is in the past, the other in the present. One is the common possession of a rich heritage of memories. The other is the actual consent, the desire to live together, the will to preserve worthily the undivided inheritance which has been handed down. Man does not improvise. The nation, like the individual, is the outcome of a long past of efforts and sacrifices and devotions. To have common glories in the past, a common will in the present, to have done great things together, to will to do the like again, such are the essential conditions for the making of a people." Enlightened nationalism is not some blind worship of the nation. It is not a nationalism that wishes to denigrate or dominate others. It is the passionate attachment to one's country, its history, heroes, literature, traditions, culture, language, and faith. It is the spirit that enables a people to endure, as the Polish people endured, under occupation and oppression, to rise again to live in the sunlight. Intellectuals, writes Regis Debray, forget that nations hibernate, but empires grow old, that the American nation will outlast the Atlantic Empire, as the Russian nation will outlast the Soviet Empire. This community called a nation is more than any division of labor or market that may encompass it. Adds Renan, "Community of interests is assuredly a powerful bond between men, but nevertheless, can interests suffice to make a nation? I do not believe it. Community of interests makes commercial treaties. There is a sentimental side to nationality. It is at once body and soul. A Zollverein is not a fatherland. An economy is not a country. A nation's economic system should reinforce the bonds of national unity, but the nation is of a higher order than any imaginary construct of an economist. A nation is organic, alive. It has a beating heart. The people of a nation are a moral community who must share values higher than economic interest, or their nation will not endure. As scholar Christian Kopf asks, what doth it profit a man if he gain the whole world and suffer the loss of his country? What is wrong with the global economy is what is wrong with our politics. It is rooted in the myth of economic man. It elevates economics above all else, but man does not live by bread alone. In a true nation, many things are placed on a higher altar than maximum efficiency or a maximum variety of consumer goods. Once conservatives understood that. Neither the national economy nor the free market is an end in itself. They are means to an end. A national economy is not some wild, roaring river that must be allowed to find its course, to find any course it will, to be admired for its raw power and beauty. It is to be tamed for the benefit of the nation. The same holds true for the market. While an unfettered free market is the most efficient mechanism to distribute the goods of a nation, there are higher values than efficiency. To worship the market is a form of idolatry no less than worshiping the state. The market should be made to work for man, not the other way around. What is the market? It is the law of the jungle, the law of nature. And what is civilization? It is the struggle against nature. So declared France's Prime Minister Edouard Balladur at the close of the GATT negotiations of 1993. He is right. End quote. Okay, so that basically that section there where he talks about, what is a nation, and a nation is clearly something more than just a market. It's something more than a collection of consumers. There's a connection. He's got the quote from Ernest Renan, and he talks about how nationalism is not some blind worship of the nation. It's not a nationalism that wishes to degrade or denigrate or dominate others, but it is a passionate attachment to one's own country, its history, heroes, etc., etc. So it's enlightened nationalism, as he calls it. It's a love for one's own, but it's also a recognition that there are higher values than just efficiency. There are other things that must be considered. And even if the total free market is the absolute most efficient manner of distributing goods, there are other things besides efficiency. And you probably shouldn't tinker with the market in order to try to make it more efficient. That's really kind of where the socialists in many ways fail. But you can tinker with the market when you have other things to consider besides just efficiency, such as national defense and the integrity of the nation state and the geopolitical position and the capacity of people to have high-paying manufacturing jobs. And there are a whole host of reasons why the nation state has its own. It is more close to like an end than just the economy. Where he says, I like where he says, neither the national economy nor the free market is an end in itself. They are means to an end. And the end that they are means to is the long-term prosperity and viability of the nation, which, when achieved, provides for the prosperity of the members of the nation. So I've discussed quite a bit about protectionism and markets, and there's a lot more in this book. There's a lot of history in this book as well that I really kind of glossed over. But it's a good book. Pat Buchanan is on point with a lot of things. He called a lot of this stuff well ahead of time, and I think that many on the modern right agree that we really wish Pat Buchanan had won that election in 92 or 96 or 2000 or any of the times that he tried to run for president. We wish that you were president, sir. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time. Goodbye.